Welcome everyone to the Rejoin EU Party panel. We do this every month, at the end of every month, and we're talking about 4 years on from Brexit.
Vote Rejoin EU.
Vote Rejoin EU.
Brendan, could you introduce yourself to everyone, please?
Hello, I'm Brendan Donnelly. I'm at the moment the leader of the Rejoin EU Party. I'm a former MP, and surprisingly, as it may seem, I'm a former Conservative MEP. But that was a long time ago and in another country, and the wench is dead.
John?
I'm a member of the Rejoin the EU Party. I'm also a former Conservative MEP, and I'm the chair of the Federal Trust.
Richard?
And my name is Richard Hewison. I'm the treasurer of the Rejoin EU Party. I have no connection to the Conservative Party ever in my life, and indeed I have always been a member of a party opposing it, be it the Green Party, the Liberal Democrats, or the Labour Party. But exactly the same reason, we need to rejoin the EU, and that's why I'm here in this party.
Hi, I'm Alex Kerr, also known as Political X on YouTube, and I'm going to be hosting this. I help out with the social media with the Rejoin EU Party. So, question is, 4 years on, Brexit, has it been a success? Who would like to go first in answering that question?
I think you first have to define what supposedly was going to be a success. That was one of the problems of Brexit. Different people were voting for different things and very often contradictory things. But if we look at some of the things that people thought would be a success, economic progress, economic advance, that certainly hasn't happened. All the academic and professional studies, economic studies, make it clear that we have suffered as a result of Brexit. Obviously, because it's a hypothetical, we have to have slightly different assessments of what the damage is. But nobody doubts that it is damage and it's going to be continuing damage. We were told we could change all these terrible laws that have been imposed upon us by Brussels. When we come to it, there are very, very few laws indeed that we do want to change. And indeed, we're finding ourselves having to adapt to laws made by others because it's an insanity to believe that you can systematically distance yourself from the regulations of your nearest neighbour with whom you conduct so much of your trade. Most of the legislation that came from the European Union was shaped by the United Kingdom. So there's no point in willfully trying to distance ourselves from it. The other thing that was sometimes mentioned as a benefit was reducing migration, reducing immigration. Well, that hasn't happened. One of the reasons why the government makes such a fuss about the boats coming over, the illegal immigration in some cases, is that they want to distract attention from the enormous wave of legal migration which has come to this country over the past 6 years. So on any hypothesis, it's been a failure. Quite apart from that, and we'll want to talk about this later, I hope, it's poisoned our political culture. It's introduced lies and fantasy as being the norm into British politics. In some ways, I see that as being the greatest failure of Brexit.
Anyone want to agree or disagree with that? Richard?
Well, just for the sake of balance, I'm going to take an opposite conclusion. Your question was Brexit a success? And I would say Brexit has been an outstanding, terrific success, because the person behind Brexit is, of course, Vladimir Putin. And from his point of view, it has been an outstanding success. I think we need to see it in the sort of wider political context and remind ourselves of the timeline. It was 2014 that Putin first invaded Ukraine to great international condemnation and then got bogged down and mired. He then switched to interfering using social media in elections around the world. And I think Brexit in 2016 was very much the prototype, the test, so to speak, as to the power of what that intervention was. And sadly for our democracy, it was a great success. I also think that without Brexit being a success in early 2016, the same techniques that Russia used wouldn't have been quite so successful in the US presidential that year, which of course installed Trump over Clinton, and the economic chaos or the global socio-political chaos, I should say, has unfolded since then. So in terms of the enemies of democracy, the illiberals, the nationalists, Brexit has been a terrific success. It just hasn't delivered any benefits for anyone who actually voted for it in this country.
It's not too surprising that it was, immediately after COVID that he went in again to Crimea when the EU's at its weakest. I'm no doubt if COVID hadn't happened, he would have gone in sooner. John?
Well, I'd like to focus on the constitutional dimension of Brexit, and in particular what it's meant for Northern Ireland and for Scotland, and also for the regions of England. And Brexit was sold as being something which would unite the country, which would lead to levelling up of the differences that exist within the UK, very significant economic differences, particularly between London and the rest of the country. In many respects, Brexit was a vote against London rather than a vote against Brussels. But what we have is an enormous crisis in Northern Ireland. The issue of Irish reunification was a sleeping issue before Brexit, and it's come back to life, and with all the problems that could entail. And we have a totally dysfunctional system in Northern Ireland now. I mean, the fact that the devolved government there has been restored, it really hides its continuing dysfunction, actually, and inability to provide proper government for Northern Ireland. There's an ongoing financial crisis there. In Scotland, we've had a revival of Scottish nationalism. And the situation that you have at least half the population of Scotland in one form or another unhappy with the current state of the Union, and that this is an ongoing issue that seems to offer no easy solution, and which may well crystallize at some point, not yet, but probably after the general election, into a choice between two unions. Is it better for Scotland to be in the EU or in the UK? Because support for Scottish independence has stabilized around 50%, perhaps a bit below. But support for rejoining the EU in Scotland is nearly 70%. And this is an enormous gap, which shows a dysfunction. And then you have the situation within the regions of England, that there has been no levelling up. In fact, Brexit has made the inequalities in the British economy, particularly for deprived areas in the north, northeast, and in Wales, much more difficult. And we've just seen that in the closure of the Talbot steelworks. We've seen ongoing problems over trying to create some form of enterprise zone in the northeast. I mean, this is just the beginning of tearing, a process of tearing at the unity of the United Kingdom. And I think as time goes on, this will emerge as one of the really big consequences, big negative consequences of Brexit.
I very much agree about the levelling up agenda. There was absolutely no reason why the Conservative government, if it had wanted to, between 2010 and 2016, couldn't have pursued a levelling up agenda if it wanted to. It had nothing to do with the European Union. That was simply a make-weight fantasy, which was put forward by the people who had done absolutely the opposite of levelling up for the past 6 years. And the realization that that is what has happened is a very destabilizing realization in British politics. It's created the sense that all politicians are liars, that even the thing that was presented as a future prospect, namely Brexit, which was going to put an end to inequality, has in fact exacerbated it. And while we're a little way away from the day when a majority of the population are prepared to put themselves through the trauma of another referendum or another rejoining the European Union process, the damage done to the integrity of British politics by Brexit and the way it's panned out is very, very profound. And the reform movement, of course, of the party is benefiting from that. And I don't think it's any secret or will be any surprise when after the election, when the Conservatives have lost, reform will come to be the dominant strain of conservatism in this country. And that will be a direct result of Brexit and the absence, the opposite of levelling up that it's brought about.
The Reform Party, are they our nemesis? Are they literally our antithesis?
Yes, they are the Brexit Party. They've just rebranded. They are still the Brexit Party. And just as we always see X, formerly known as Twitter, when we talk about Twitter, I think we should also say the Reform Party, formerly known as the Brexit Party. No party is more responsible for the mess that we're in, apart from arguably the Conservative Party too, than the Brexit Party. And now they're suddenly changing their name and trying to persuade us that this is nothing to do with them. And they're the people that are into democratic reform. No, it's absolute nonsense.
But they're saying that we haven't had a real Brexit. Now, I've never, ever heard an interviewer get them to explain
And neither do the Reform Party. The Reform Party don't say what a Brexit is. They just say this Brexit isn't their Brexit. And let's be frank, nobody's Brexit is anybody else's Brexit because they have no understanding of what they were actually trying to achieve with it in the first place. So that's just smoke and mirrors, quite frankly.
But one of the things they certainly hoped to do was wide-ranging changes in existing British legislation, which is based on European legislation. There was a story told, it was a fairy tale, that there were enormous changes that could be brought about to the body of English law, and particularly relating to the economic conduct of our country, that would be enormously beneficial, but which were being prevented by our membership of the European Union. That hasn't turned out to be the case, and it could never turn out to be the case. But that is the argument from the Brexit enthusiasts, the Brexit ideologues, that we only needed to have upturned 50 years of legislation, British legislation, in order to go to an El Dorado, a nirvana that would have been completely different. The people who support Brexit will be very pleased indeed when the Labour Party come into power, because then they can blame socialist incompetence rather than their own incompetence in having brought about Brexit.
Even that very point you raise is so intangible. The Reform Party telling us there's so much legislation that we could replace to make Britain better. I remember at the time of the referendum, the only firm example any Brexiter ever gave to me was the shape of bananas, which, to be quite frankly, well, is bananas. I don't think that's relevant at all. So what are these precious laws? What is this great reformation that's going to happen? What tangible examples do we have of laws that are going to genuinely bring benefit if we were not shackled to the EU? I've not heard any that are anything other than trivial.
We get our yards back.
I refer the honourable gentleman to the point I just made.
It's important in football. That's how you measure out a football pitch.
We were also told two quite contradictory things at the time of the referendum. One, that nothing much would change. So those people who were pointing towards a revolutionary situation were wrong. And yet everything would change. It was another version of having our cake and eating it. So Brexit is fundamentally flawed in its logic. And that's had a knock-on effect on the whole of British political culture, I'm afraid, because it turned out to be a success. It turned out to be something that quite a lot of people were seduced by.
Could an economy under Brexit work if it was either the free trade one, which most of them seem to be obsessed with, the Singapore and Thames, or a protectionist one, which is more likely what Labour are going to go, or a mix? Are any of those things actually viable as a way forward? John, I haven't come in for a while.
Well, the problem for Brexit was that it was sold by its most wealthy advocates, at least, as a leap in favor of free trade and deregulation. But it came at precisely the moment when global free trade began its retreat. And we are now in a process of reversing, actually, the trend of the last 30 or 40 years towards freer markets. And there is a rise of protectionism everywhere. And that is likely to continue for a whole range of very significant reasons, both to do with geopolitics and to do with climate change and the rest. And so the timing of Brexit has sort of hit the top of the market of free trade and deregulation. There's also the element of the tax evasion side of, or the low tax side of that deregulation agenda, which was also very prominent among some supporters of Brexit. Because governments everywhere are very short of money. There's been very, very high levels of public borrowing. And so the pressure on tax revenues around the world, whether we're looking at the United States or Europe or Japan, Korea, all advanced economies have very significant fiscal pressures on them. And that is going to mean that the tolerance for low taxation regimes, avoiding tax and the rest has gone, has vanished. I mean, it was the liberal regime that has been enjoyed by multinational companies over the last 30 years is on the way out. And so in that sense, too, the context for deregulation in Britain is not there. But on top of that, a very large part of the the popular support for Brexit, rather than the elite support for Brexit, came from the opposite intention of wanting to repatriate economic activity, to wanting to bring employment back into the north of England and the other regions that have been disadvantaged by the overwhelming focus on service economies in southeastern London. And if one looks at the program that Reform has on economics, I mean, it's not really very enunciated, but it is fundamentally, its logic is a protectionist one. And that is going to create very significant problems for ensuring that the model of our economy that we've had for the last 40 years can be continued. I mean, it's attempting to actually reverse a very fundamental process. And doing that without the context of a large continental scale market, trying to adjust that economic process is going to be extremely difficult and likely to be very, very destructive. And so I think that the economics of Brexit are completely out of kilter with the major trends that are now underway, not just in Europe, but around the world.
I guess with Trump and Biden and the Green Deal that Biden's brought in, it's all leading towards protectionism. That Biden's administration have not dropped the barriers they put up to China. And I've heard from former employees of the CIA saying that the military have now had extensive discussions with the White House when they quickly realized it was a really dumb idea to have all their military hardware and products produced in China and not in the United States. So apparently a lot of the military industrial capacity is being brought back into the US. Microchips are being brought back into the US. That's why there's concern over Taiwan, because it's the one part of the US manufacturing of computers that's at risk. Like we could talk, we won't go into too much detail about that. The main point is that everyone's going protectionist because hard times are hitting everyone.
It's also the fact that having a policy that encourages strategically significant production to be onshore, and also paying for climate change and the new technologies that are entailed in that, requires enormous quantities of investment, which also requires a very significant role by government. So it's not just a question of protecting by laws and favoring domestic production. It's also having the resources to do that. And that is possible for an economy the size of the United States, which has a continental scale home market. It's also possible for China, obviously, which has a continental scale home market. And of course, it's possible for the European Union, which has a continental scale home market. But if you don't have a continental scale home market, you have a real problem. And that is the problem which we have thanks to Brexit.
It's the natural resources as well. I am going to go on. I'm going to bring in sovereignty in a second. But it was interesting that Norway's just come out and said they've now found I think the largest rock phosphate deposits. Which is essential for solar panels. In fact, they've found so much it's now doubled the world's supply. We now don't have access to that unless we can get a free trade agreement with Norway. But the EU does, and it does always come to my mind, what natural resources does the UK have? It's clay, tin, and trees. And obviously we've got a workforce that's relatively well educated compared to the rest of the world. But if that's our natural resources, unless we find some lithium, which is possible in Cornwall because they've got tin, it means that the UK is not in the best position. I mean, coal is now not usable. People are going green. And we're also missing out on those opportunities to develop that industry because the USA is leading the charge.
Well,
How
Alex,
do you compete?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Richard.
You just don't believe strong enough, do you? You just don't believe. And if you did, I don't know, maybe things would be better. You're absolutely right, of course. The economic catastrophe that is now unfolding as a result of this is something that some government at some stage is going to have to address. So we're going to need to do wider trade deals with somebody than we're doing at the moment.
So is it just inevitable that we'll go back in, Brendan?
Yes, I think so. I was going to say that I suspect that halfway in through the next Labour government, they will be confronted with a number of these problems culminating and crystallizing. And it will be very difficult for them to deliver on the promises that they've made. And they'll be looking for a new narrative. And the obvious and perhaps inspiring new narrative will be if not to return to the European Union, at least to get much closer to the European Union. I suspect that at the end of the next Labour government, there will be something in the manifesto which is very much pointing towards our rejoining the European Union. It may not be going so far as to say, let's have a referendum in the next parliament, but it will be something perhaps suggesting rejoining the single market and the customs union. I think there will be difficulties, institutional difficulties about doing that. But once you've gone down the road of saying, let's rejoin the single market and the customs union, if you conclude that isn't really a possibility as a bridging position, as an interim step, then the next logical conclusion to draw from that is, well, let's do it properly and let's rejoin. So I think that the next Labour government will be willy-nilly, not because Starmer particularly wants it, but I think the force of circumstances and political pressures will push him towards a much more positive view of rejoining in the medium term than he has at the moment.
There was a very interesting stat that came out about whether or not the UK would take on the euro, and it was 48% to 52% saying if rejoining meant taking the euro, we would say 48% said yes and 52% said no. Brexiteers came out and said, wow, that's an amazing victory. When you looked at the longer trend, it's actually the highest it's ever been for taking on the euro. So it's an actual failure that, once again, Brexiteers have twisted. Now, I'm going to bring in some economic stats. And interestingly, and it does link into our attempt to run for London mayor. So if you would like to support us for running in the London mayoral election, please look at the link below, click on it. We've got a crowdfunder going and we have people willing to meet pound for pound every pound that you donate. These are some interesting economic statistics that have come from the London Mayor's Office, sponsored by the Cambridge Econometrics, I think they're called. They're a think tank group that analyze the damage done by Brexit. So 140 billion in economic output was one of their first. I'll go through them and then get your reaction. We can break them down again. We've got Londoners out of pocket by £3,400. The economy is, according to Cambridge Econometrics, 6% smaller. We have a 4% reduction according to the OBR. 2/3 of exporters have now found EU trade harder. The control costs that have come in this year have cost us 350 million. What I'm not 100% sure is that 350 million a year or just 350 million for the infrastructure. You're going to love this and hate this at the same time. £3.50 extra for a bottle of wine from Europe. No reaction, no wine drinkers in this group.
Well, okay. I think we're such addicts that £3.50 is quite a small price to pay for it. Continuing our addiction.
Oh, out of touch with the cost of living crisis, eh?
That's a bottle of milk. Well, several bottles of milk. Now, this is interesting as well, because this came up. EU citizens have found it 5 times harder to enter into the UK. It's increased, and we could talk about the damage it's done to tourism. Oxford and Cambridge have been decimated by this new policy. But it's interesting as well, because we could talk about Labour starting to reverse some of this. There are some indications they're going to reverse. What are your initial thoughts to hearing all those stats? And let me know if you want me to go through them one by one.
If I could just start off, I think one of the reasons, Alex, you got very little reaction from us is because how is any of this unexpected? This is exactly what we've been expecting since the debate started at the 2015 election. These are exactly the sort of issues that we went to. And one more statistic to add to your list. In the first month after we officially left the European Union, 1.3 trillion in assets moved from the UK into the Eurozone. Now, that money has not come back. Now, obviously, that's not direct income from us, but it was sort of management of that was at the heart of a lot of London's prosperity. And just to put 1.3 trillion in context, that's the entire lifetime output of GDP of a city the size of Birmingham. And that sort of thing is just not going to be undone by some of the tinkering around the edges that we're getting talked by the Labour Party at the moment.
One reason why you may not have had as startled a reaction as perhaps you expected, Alex, it is obviously in addition to the fact that these figures are expected by us. It's also the fact that there is a sort of apathy in British politics, which won't react to these figures. You can go on citing these figures almost indefinitely, But until British politics is jerked out of its present apathy, which may happen after the general election, simply people will meet these statistics, not quite with a shrug, but with a frown, but they won't think we should rejoin. And underlying that, I think, is the domination of much of the mass media by a clique of oligarchs, if you will, of people who direct the mass media of the United Kingdom and who have made it clear that they are not going to tolerate our returning to the European Union. So a lot of people take the view, we can't put ourselves as a country through the trauma that we went through in 2016, even if we have these economic statistics, which are so important and so persuasive. We are very reluctant to go back to revisit the issues of 2016. And that's where we come in, it seems to me. We, the Rejoin EU party, have to point out to people that this is fool's gold, that you're not going to be able to continue indefinitely to ignore the damage which we are doing to ourselves economically and politically. Certainly it will be painful to repair the damage which has been done, but it's a sign of a profoundly decadent political culture that when it's made a mistake, it can't repair the mistake. And I hope that as a result of pressure from various quarters, of which I hope the Rejoin EU party will be one, the Labour Party in its next term in office will find itself moving in this direction. If it isn't, then we're in a very parlous state as a country, it seems to me, and not merely economically.
It seems that we're the pressure group.
Yep.
We need people to watch this, support it, to click on our links, to click the like button, to click the subscribe button, because this needs to change. We need to show the government that actually people's attitudes have changed because they're sick and tired of this economic situation. It was interesting with the London Mayor's office coming out and saying it's costing Londoners £3,400 because we've just done a poll on Twitter, which had 1,800 votes. And we said, would you take £1,000 or rejoin the EU? And 92% said they wanted to rejoin the EU. Over £1,000.
I saw one response to that inquiry where the individual asked, is it a real £1,000 or is it a hypothetical £1,000? I don't know if any of you remember, I'm sure you don't, Alex, but the older among us might. The quiz showed, no, it wasn't Double Your Money. It was another quiz show where the key to the box was bid for by the compere. And the compere would put pound notes in front of the nose of the young man or young woman who was the contestant, and then take the money, open the box, was called from the background. Very often the physical presence of the money persuaded people that they should sell their right to open the box or whatever it was. So I think you have to be a little bit careful.
I would turn around and say to that, if we were out in the street offering £1,000, I'm no doubt everyone would take the £1,000. But I'm also in no doubt that they'd also sneak off and vote to rejoin the EU.
I'm also in no doubt that if we did that, we'd be up for bribery by the Electoral Commission very, very quickly. And the future for our party might be rather grim as a result.
No, they couldn't do that because we're bribing people against our interests. We're saying...
We're bribing people. Okay, I see. We're still offering money to vote in a certain way,
but not in an election. Not in an election.
Just in a hypothetical.
In a hypothetical referendum. I wouldn't like to be arguing that case to the EC.
Well, we don't have to. We don't have to argue it because it's already been done on Twitter.
I'd be asking questions of the treasurer of the party if they were out in the street giving away £1,000 rather than investing it in some more good quality videos that you do, Alex.
Oh, you charmer. John.
The problem is how we get to another vote on rejoining. And this is what Brendan was saying, is that we have a political culture that is in denial. And it's not quite clear what the circumstances are going to be that forces reversing Brexit onto the agenda. And my fear is that the longer this goes on, the more serious those forces have to be and will be. I mean, just one instance. I mean, if we're talking about getting closer to the EU again and having some form of reintegration of the single market, I mean, that is certainly going to increase the pressure in Scotland for full-blown independence, because a lot of the opposition to independence in Scotland at the moment is about the problems that there would be with the border and the problems with the currency. But the more people appreciate that we're heading for a closer relationship, it will be easier for Scottish nationalists to argue, well, let's rejoin fully and be a full member. Let's be at the table, not be a rule taker, be one of the rule makers. And I think also what happens in Ireland is going to have an impact on Scotland. And this is likely to be highly destabilizing for the British state. You also talked about the euro and attitudes towards the euro. I mean, the big issue facing London as a financial center is the long-term position that it has in managing and dealing in euro-denominated securities and euro-denominated business. And although there have been delays on this, it does seem that next year there will be a very significant step prohibiting, effectively, London-based houses from having a major role in some important parts of euro-denominated financial infrastructure.
Yep.
Now, that is going to be hugely damaging over time. And all these issues are building up. And at some point, they're going to reach a crisis level. And unless we start facing up to this issue now, we will find ourselves overtaken by a crisis, which could have all sorts of consequences, which could be extremely negative for our democracy, for the structure of the state, for the structure of our society. And I think that this delay in facing up to the mistake that is Brexit, this incapacity to reverse a mistake, and people who can't correct their mistakes are in trouble. And countries that can't correct their mistakes are in trouble.
It almost feels like we were driving a Ferrari that needed a little bit of TLC. And we were told, no, take the Ford Fiesta instead. It's a better model. And then we get into the car and we realize it's an awful model. And then we're told by all the passengers, you're not allowed to go and take it back for a refund. That's what it feels like.
The drivers. We're told by the drivers, not by the passengers in this case. It's the drivers, the politicians.
That's true. Well, that's an interesting thing you bring up there, because 85% of millennials are now saying we want in. We've had enough. This is not working. And it's like, well, then it's done. I mean, Mike Galsworthy brought that up with Farage, and you could see Farage had no argument. It was almost like he couldn't deal with that factoid. So he came back and he said that the far right and the far left are on the rise in Europe. And it's like, well, no, it's a recession. As soon as the recession's over, they calm down again. And I've never seen in history that type of far right, far left getting more than 30% of the vote. 31, 33%, I think, is the maximum I've ever seen. So a third. I mean, you may be able to set up some sort of government, but I mean, I was even saying, I was even saying the EU's actually done a bit of a check on dictatorships. I'm in no doubt if Viktor Orban had been around during the days of Hitler and Mussolini, he would have turned Hungary into a dictatorship. No doubt. I'm more than happy to say that and feel the wrath and the consequences. He would have turned it into a dictatorship. And I feel that the EU's done its exact job and put a check on him and stop him going whole hog. And that's not to say he hasn't put huge restrictions and he has huge control over Hungary. He does. I've been there. I've spent a couple of months there, almost had a job there. I know a lot of the locals there. It's a very oppressed society, and Viktor Orban's to blame. But I think even Meloni has had a check on her on that. Brexit's put a check on her because she suddenly realized, well, actually saying we should have a Talexit is a terrible idea.
You said we'd talk about sovereignty, and
yeah,
I think
we can.
In that context, perhaps it's good for countries to have some check on their sovereignty. That they haven't, that they're not allowed, because it will have implications for their neighbors, for stability in the region, to have an absolutely unrestrained and unfettered approach to elected dictatorship, which is something that seems to be a rather attractive model for certain people on the right of British politics, and on the left as well, but they're less prominent at the moment. But the idea that the Parliament or the executive shouldn't be restrained by the law which is something that in recent weeks a number of prominent Conservatives have said in terms, is something which is very worrying, and is in a way a certain restriction on the sovereignty of the executive, but quite right too. The European Convention on Human Rights is a restriction, if you like, on sovereignty, a benevolent and desirable restriction on sovereignty. The idea that a passing majority in the House of Commons should be able to undermine our human rights is a worrying one. And if by pooling our sovereignty with others we can make that less likely, then that's something that everybody benefits from in the country, apart from the people who want to exercise this quasi-dictatorial power.
Putin, Hitler, Napoleon, Mussolini all got in. Mussolini we could debate. All got in through democratic means and then dismantled the system.
I remember in academic circles, I would discuss quite a lot with German colleagues the way in which the European Union acted as a sort of check on populism. And most Germans accept that idea that you need to have a constitutional background which acts as a check on the excesses of day-to-day politicians. In this country, we were arrogant enough to think that we didn't need that check. And that was one of the reasons why Brexit came to be accepted by the electorate. We were above that sort of thing. We didn't need to be restrained by others. But the way events have panned out over the past 6 or 7 years makes me much less optimistic than perhaps I was in 2016. I think that the glue of our society, the constitutional and democratic glue of our society, needed reinforcing from outside, and the European Union was doing that in a way that perhaps even people like ourselves didn't always realise until we'd lost it.
It's interesting with Northern Ireland as well, because they had 2 referendums. Here's the deal. Do you want to check out a deal? There's the deal. Do you want to accept this deal? We were just told the comparison I always make is it's a buffet. There was a group of Brexiteers basically saying you can have anything you want and it'll be perfect. Whatever it is, it'll be perfect. Farage said that. Hanan said that. I mean, Farage flip-flopped. He said Norway about 16 times as an example, which is in the single market, and is now turning around and saying, no, he never said that. I mean, he's been pulled up on it and caught out. But it's funny that Rees-Mogg said we should probably have a second referendum. Farage is on camera saying we should probably have a second referendum. And of course, you know, when it comes to it, it's just complete chaos. And they won it was almost like they got that first vote and that's all that mattered. So it had to go through. And I almost feel as if we had to go through it to see how bad it is. Because what you end up having is what's happened in the past, where if it doesn't go through, you'll have all these conspiracy theorists for decades saying, we've been cheated. So eventually it'll have to happen anyway.
Well, they're right that we've been cheated. The question is, who did the cheating?
Exactly.
And what was the nature of the deception?
Well, you brought up Putin earlier. Swansea University, Cardiff University have shown there are over 100,000 active bots on social media. Facebook just got caught out. No, sorry, I'll change that. It's just been discovered that out of the top 20 US Christian sites on Facebook, 19 of them are Russian troll farms. That's the level that we're dealing with in terms of interference from Putin and interference in our elections. And we're not even allowed to bring that up and question it on TV. We never hear this stuff on the media, or very rarely.
Well, there is a view in Russia that it's the new Rome, that it's the new home of Western Christianity. So I think it's appropriate that they have taken over all these supposedly pseudo-Christian sites in America.
Anyway, we're sidetracking from Brexit. So I think we can all pretty much agree Brexit has not been the success that it's claimed to have been. I'm pretty sure that means that Nigel Farage should move out the country. Is that correct?
Well, he reserves to himself the right to decide whether it's been a success or not. And I suspect he'll continue to believe it has been potentially. He has said that Brexit has failed in the past, hasn't he? But of course, it was the fault of other people, the people who didn't believe enough, who didn't implement it in the way that he wanted it implemented.
But then that almost brings us all the way back to the start. What is this fantasy that they're talking about? I've heard Ben Habib complain about Northern Ireland, and I'm like, right. So what do you want? Do you want an open border, do you want a hard border? I don't know what he wants. I don't think, and again, I've never heard anyone challenge him. I don't see how you can have an open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland unless you've got either what we have, this sort of quasi-weird deal at the moment that no one likes, or you're in the single market. I don't really see, and the single market's the preferable thing. I don't see a solution to that. John, you wanted to bring up sovereignty in Northern Ireland. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think Ben Habib's position is to have a hard border in Ireland, isn't it? I mean, he's a hardline unionist in essence. And that was certainly the hope of the DUP, I think, and other Ulster unionists who voted for Brexit, because they thought that it would actually make an all-Ireland economy more difficult. In fact, of course, it's precipitated the circumstances which are accelerating the creation of an all-Ireland economy and diminishing trade across the Irish Sea with the rest of Britain.
Hard border that they could blame the Irish Republic for. The Republic
That's right, yes. I mean, it wasn't just the hard border, it was also the blame was particularly attractive.
Without their fingerprints being on it. And that was a very good example of cakeism. That you could have something but not have its consequences or be blamed for its consequences.
But that's just going to bring the troubles back. The new IRA have been on TV and said, you put anything on that border, we'll blow it up. We'll consider it a military threat. Now, you can take it with a pinch of salt if it's true. Like, are they actually going to do it? But they're saying it.
Well, I think there is clearly a danger that the more the identity issue in Ireland is highlighted by Brexit, the more there is a danger of violence on both sides in the situation. And I think that the problem at the root of all this is that Brexit has created a form of identity politics in Britain which did not exist before, which has many different levels. I mean, one is the resurgence of Irish nationalism in Northern Ireland, of Scottish nationalism in Scotland. There is resentment of the regions, but there's also the question of identity politics within the various communities in Britain, which is coming to the fore because of the saliency that immigration had in bringing Brexit on, and in the fact that the promises to reduce immigration have not been met by the standards of those who voted for Brexit, and they feel betrayed by this. And so what we've got is a poison entering into British politics, which did not exist before, where identity issue, British, English, what is it, where the loyalties really lie? And these are very, very dangerous questions in a society as complex and as multifaceted now, as multicultural in many respects, as the UK now is. And that, I think, may prove to be the really dangerous element in Brexit, that we have a new type of politics that is not just about untruth and undemocratic processes entering into our political habits, but there is a much deeper question of who we are. And that countries that face a question of who they are countries with deep, deep problems.
Well, the war on woke is part of this identity crisis. It's very interesting that in the rhetoric of people like Shapps, the easy assimilation is Britain-hating woke enthusiasts. Wokeness, which is in some ways traditional British virtues of tolerance and respect and understanding for other people, is regarded as being something suspicious. Because there's no economic argument that can be won in favour of Brexit, it's very tempting for the ground to be shifted to the identity questions. And the identity questions fall in very easily with the war on woke, which is only attractive to a very small percentage of the population, but is, in the view of the Conservative Party and in the view of the right-wing press, very attractive to that minority. It will, as it were, cement a floor for the right wing in British politics that they'll never fall below. It's a dangerous tactic, both electorally and nationally.
I mean, if anything, that's the one thing that Brexit did increase, is the amount of hate crime that's gone through the roof since Brexit. I can remember on the day after, there was a British Asian reporter, I think for Channel 4, I cannot find the clip, who was saying, oh, it's the day after Brexit. And it was outside, I think, King's Cross. Some guy walked up behind her, or was from distance away behind her, and shouted, "Get out of my country." And that was like, wow, that's everything about Brexit. I mean, that's been the key issue, is migration.
Well, not all Brexiters are racist,
no,
but most
no.
racists are Brexiters.
Yes. Yeah. That's on that cheerful note. 4 years of Brexit, no, I don't think there's any real successes here.
And it's not going to get any better. That's an important point I think we ought to inject into the conversation.
Unless, of course, you vote for us. So press the like button, press the subscribe button. Please look down in the description if you'd like to donate for our London Mayor campaign. We want to put some pressure on both Labour and the Conservatives to start waking up to the problems of Brexit.
Embark on a majestic journey with the Rejoin EU party and support our cause on Patreon. Be part of the movement.
Vote Rejoin EU. Join the EU vision.